I'm Matt Tice with the Insurgent Mindset. How are you going today, Rondo?
Well, I'm Rondo Moses.
Good to see you, Rondo. I'm looking forward to today's discussion about professional services and what's changing, how is it being disrupted, how is it evolving, where is it heading? Should be really interesting. This is in our backyard. So
Yeah.
why don't you give us a bit of a kind of an overall 10,000 foot view of what we're going to talk about today, and then we'll dive in.
Yeah, I mean, these professional services, we're thinking about it from the perspective of like law and accounting and consulting and other services. This is really a mostly conservative sectors, right? When you think about them, they're slow to change, slow moving, very sort of reputation, relationship based. And so it's interesting to see that there have been some evolution in these industries, in these sectors as well. And I think as I've been talking to folks and in some of my work, what I'm seeing is that, these industries are not protected from some of the external disruption that's happening across some of the other sectors. And I know we'll get into it in a lot more detail, but I think if you're looking at it, for example, in terms of technology, I think professional services is being disrupted in a lot of ways by various technology, whether it's just general automation or AI. It's having an impact in these industries, in these sort of more conservative industries, as well as some of the other industries. And I also think that because of the client dynamics, the continuing pressure that clients, regardless of the sector, are experiencing to contain costs and be more dynamic. That pressure is coming back on the services firms and pushing them to do things differently.
Right. I mean, full disclosure here, we work with a lot of clients in this area, law, accounting, recruiting, marketing, et cetera, with the key question, what's around the corner and how will that business model be affected by all these forces that you're mentioning? And I think you're right in a sense that there are some dynamics that are very durable, sort of the face-to-face or client to consultant, client to accountant, client to lawyer relationship. That's a big R relationship in a sense that really matters and is very durable. And those relationships tend to be really wrapped together in, kind of deep advisory and deep trust, which is built up over a relatively long period of time for most firms and their clients. So from that point of view, that's something that's probably not going to change that much. But it's also interesting because at the higher levels of the firm, those relationships have much more depth, are much more sticky, or much more rich as
Right.
compared to the junior levels, right? So as all these sort of, as to your point about particularly technology, but offshoring plays a role, changing kind of dynamics in terms of the expectations of probably the younger demographic of
Yeah.
economic buyer versus sort of the more traditional. There's lots of factors that play into how this is all changing, but I think it'll be really interesting to talk about, is that business model the traditional um, pyramid business model, which is really built around leverage between the seniors and the juniors, and the almost arbitrage between the labor value of the junior people to do the work and the senior people that build the relationships.
Right.
Will that start to erode, and to what degree will that change how these firms operate, compete, engage with clients, et cetera? I think it really sets the table for an interesting discussion.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you asked the question. I would say that it has started. It's not starting. It has started. It's been started. At least here in the U.S., if you look at, for example, the legal sector, the past, if you look back the past decade prior to that, corporate legal departments wouldn't look beyond a traditional law firm for external legal support, right? But now, they have other options. For one, you have the alternative, legal service providers, the ALSPs, who have grown significantly over the past decade or so. I think this is a sector now that's about $29 billion. And since I think 2021, they've been growing at a clip about 18% a year. And both in-house counsel and even some law firms are turning to this alternative model for legal support because they can do things faster and at a lower cost, especially when you're thinking about some of the routine, lower end legal activities like research, document review, contract management, that kind of stuff. They can do it a lot more, a lot cheaper and a lot faster.
Right. And from the point of view of the professional services firm, who's doing that routine work, Rondo? Is that the senior partner or is that
Yeah, it's
the
the
relatively
associates.
junior person, the associate coming into the firm? That's essentially how these individuals who come into a firm, and it doesn't matter whether it's law, management, consulting, accounting, and so on,
Yeah,
uh, that's how they build their trade, right? They build their skills doing the routine stuff and progressively work up to the more complex work, right?
yeah,
So to your point, I think, and one thing we've observed with a lot of our clients is that the way professional services businesses view their their model and their relationship with clients is, of course, first very much client centric. What that ends up meaning is like sector focus and things like that, or specialization in a particular area of law or accounting or whatever, tax or advisory, whatever that might be. Um,
yeah,
but increasingly, the challenge comes not from sector or client relationship so much as from particular workflows or jobs to be done within that sort of economic engine. So, routine tax advice or tax forms or routine accounting analysis, whatever those sort of lower level things that are happening. But because firms don't necessarily view themselves in through the lens of workflows,
right,
uh, they leave themselves a little bit vulnerable for those that do. And those that do are typically platform providers who create standardized workflows that then can be done at scale, thousands or millions of times, build up data over time, and
right.
slowly but surely displace the job to be done inside the firm with technology or with automated workflows or increasingly AI, or even taking those workflows to expand the labor arbitrage maybe to the Philippines or India or whatever, where you have very highly skilled workers who can follow a very discrete process, and that creates, a much lower cost proposition, which
Yeah,
then kind of hollows out that capability at the bottom of the firm.
yeah. I have a couple of very close friends who have, small law firms. And over the past, I would say 5 years or so, they've started to outsource some of their junior associate work to the Philippines, India, because they can get them at such low rates that they feel like, and the quality, from what I understand, the quality is really good because there's a high interest in delivering and providing a service that meets their client, in this case, my friend's expectations. So, they're seeing the need to do that. They're doing that on a small level. I would imagine that, some of the larger firms are trying to also figure out, which activities can they outsource to other lower cost, countries to get done because it could be very expensive here to do that.
Right. And increasingly, the trade-off is, do you go to a SaaS provider to do that, right? Um,
Hmm.
do you go to an offshore provider, a BPO or whatever, or do you go to AI and have, engineer a chat bot around it?
Right.
Or do you exit? Do you say, look, we're going to focus more on the premium services uh, at the higher part of the value chain
Right.
than the lower part? And these are all choices I think that firms have to make. I mean, most firms are doing some combination of all of these things in different parts of their economic and business model. But I think it's really interesting because there are some consequences to that. So first, I suppose offshoring to make that work, you really do need to understand your workflow. You need to understand client expectations. You need to be able to train your partner to be able to do that. And then you need to have some control over your partners so that at some level, they don't just disappear with all of your IP, your client information, et cetera.
Right,
So that
right.
security risk is really important from that point of view, both in terms of actual security, data security, for example, but also the resilience of your firm because you're now vulnerable and sort of dependent on this capability. So I think that's a factor. And then when you start thinking about kind of the SaaS kind of platform solutions that plug into some of that capability has other risks related to data security and cyber and things like that, which are really
Hmm.
important.
Hmm.
But you know, the problem is, and this is always a case with disruption, is that um, these services are available to everybody. So that commoditization of this capability, eventually the client says, well, do I need the firm to be the intermediary between me
Right.
and the Philippine BPO outsourcer or the AI chatbot or the SaaS provider? And the answer increasingly is no. So what happens is clients insource more of that activity, and that sort of hollows out that bottom level of value for the professional services firm, which is problematic if that's your engine to create your future partners, which your economic model sort of depends on. So I
Yeah.
think that's something that firms really need to get a handle on is, where is that value and at what point does the sort of economic model where that leverage plays such a key role, at what point does that start to break down or even collapse? I think a lot
Yeah.
of firms aren't really thinking about this.
Yeah, but I also think that, we're talking about, the outsourcing component, but there are other disruptors that are happening too, right? It's also that there's competition coming in from non-traditional areas, right? So, for example, in the legal space, you have accounting firms who are dabbling in providing legal services, for example. So that's another, non-traditional competitor, coming into the space. I was just reading that KPMG US Law just launched in February in Arizona. That's the first of the big four who's been able to do that. It won't be the last. So they're getting, at least from that perspective, the legal sector, they're getting competition also from non-traditional channels as well. So they've got to manage sort of the migration toward automation, which has been accelerating, which is accelerating because of AI and the advancement of AI. I think it's only going to get worse, but also because of the disruption coming from other non-traditional sources as well. That makes it tight. That makes that pricing pressure, that ability to deliver it faster pressure from the clients go up even higher as well.
Yeah. I think the good news for professional services firms is exactly as you've described, that pressure um, is is a kind of a tailwind for a lot of professional services firms because their clients are trying to deal with these issues too. And of course, providing advice to support those is helpful. So I think
Mhm.
that's always been, as these different changes in the economy flows through, that supports the industry. But your point about KPMG is an interesting one because if you look over almost 50 years, there's like big, long ebb and flow cycles where the largest firms will consolidate or move into adjacent spaces like management consulting, law, advisory, whatever, and they become more monolithic. And then the down cycle is that they find that they're unable to do that, or regulators sort of intervene and then force them to break up, and they go through these big cycles where they consolidate, break apart, consolidate, break apart. I think that is interesting. But I think the bigger disruptor to me, or the bigger change is, I think a lot of the value in terms of monetizing these workflows is accruing to the platform providers and not the management consultants, accountants, lawyers, marketing professionals,
Right.
whatever. I think that what's happening is these firms, and you made the point a minute ago that, you know, different parts of the value chain are sort of monetizing themselves in the tens of billions of dollars, where that value isn't accruing to the firm, it's accruing to um, those who are able to provide these utilities to the firms.
Right.
And I think for the most part, particularly if you look at AI for the moment we're in, for the most part right now, we're in the co-pilot phase almost, where um, accounting firms, for example, or law firms are using this technology capability to augment the capability that they have now to do it better, faster, cheaper, or to displace lower cost labor.
Yeah.
There's still the leverage model there because the leverage is still now the leverage is shifted from people to technology, and that still exists. But as that gets commoditized and these utilities become more and more available to clients, the challenge will be how do you uphold that that economic
Yeah.
growth.
And then on the accounting side, the use of technology is big, of course, AI. One of the boards that I'm on, our the firm that does our annual audit uses technology to do, uses AI bots to do the, transaction audit, to do usually in the past, what they would do is take a sample of the transactions and manually audit them, but they don't need to do that now. They can actually do this sort of auditing real time of transactions, and that's done with technology. It's cheaper and it's faster and it's much more widespread. So it's very interesting. The other thing about accounting that's interesting is that has been a decline in the number of folks, young people who are pursuing the CPA credentials. So they actually have a talent crunch in the accounting sort of audit space as well, which is really putting a pressure on them, which is also making a case for technology and creating leverage in that sector as well.
Hmm. I really like that. I think it's always important to focus on the people. Here in Australia, in accounting in particular, um, my numbers are correct, but I'll just caveat this with they're not in front of me. So I believe there's a 7 to 8% growth year on year in demand for
Mm,
accounting and accounting services in this market. Okay. But there's a 7 to 8% deficit in the supply of those resources, to your point. We're not minting enough accountants to meet that demand. So that sort of 14 to 16% gap is pretty significant. So when you have a gap like that, it papers over a lot of these challenges that we're talking about because, well, there's a lot more demand than there is supply, so therefore rates go up, which is great. And then that obviously, theoretically at least, gives these firms some breathing room to be able to make some of these adjustments that we're discussing here. But where are those resources going? So first, we made the earlier point that as technology and other factors displace the junior resources, that pushes down wages for those individuals, right? Because there's now a substitute for that labor. So that's one challenge. And even though there's demand, you can't think of demand in a vacuum because the demand for the type of talent, for example, that would choose to be a CPA, someone who's highly analytical, perhaps introverted, whatever it might be. There's a persona for that. And those individuals can go and get 2, 3, 4x the salary working as a business analyst in a tech firm, for example, where
right.
they might be instead of paying, getting paid 70, 80, $100,000 in their first year, they're 190, 200,
Right,
225,
right.
right? So, there's a demand for that type of labor in other places that maybe didn't exist so much before. Probably a little bit less true in law, but certainly in accounting and I think management consulting sort of fits somewhere in the middle, taking some of those analytical resources, but even in management consulting, that analytical workflow is also being affected by tech.
The other thing that's happening in the U.S. in the accounting space is the inflow of PE money. So you're seeing a roll up of some of the small and medium accounting firms because they're getting the middle ones are getting money from PE, and they're taking that money and they're using to buy up and acquire smaller firms to give them more capacity. They're using it to invest in technology And they're also using it to attract some of the talent that they need by, offering higher and more competitive pay packages, to your point. So they're getting private equity is getting involved. I mean, where this is in the past, this was more of a partnership, traditional partnership model. Now you've got private equity money, operating in that space as well. A lot.
Sure. And I think there's a great case for private equity in this model because you can imagine as all this change washes through the economy, these middle firms will get squeezed, right?
Right.
And
Right.
so, on one hand, as these workflows get more and more professional, private equity firm can say, well, okay, let's bring together all these firms and then automate all the workflows underneath and then free up more capacity, for example, for selling and client relationships and so forth. There's value to be extracted there. So that's one. And then I think two, obviously, the traditional roll-up model is based on the idea that maybe you get 1 to 1.4 times revenue for a middle-sized firm. Um, but
Right.
a larger firm might trade at 1.5, 1.6 times revenue. So that sort of little game that the private equity firms do to kind of create the roll up and extract the value in a bigger deal later on makes a lot of sense. And that there's no difference between that and any other industry. But I think to your point, though, is that this technology gives professional services something that it's almost never had, which is some level of scalability, which
Right.
typically the problem, I think the fundamental problem with the professional services business model is that it's always scaled on quite a linear curve,
Right.
right? Because it's
Right.
a function of one unit of
People.
labor equals 1.2, 1 point, or sorry, 1, 2, 4, 6 times revenue, but it's
Right.
flat. It doesn't increase or decrease. It's simply a matter of rates, utilization, and the game between those two factors creates the leverage. Sorry, the three factors come together to create that value. But it's hard to squeeze more value from that stone because it's dependent on units of labor.
What are you
So
seeing? What are you
now,
seeing in what are you seeing in like the HR space or marketing? Are you seeing similar shifts toward, I would imagine technology, of course, but what are some of the other shifts you're seeing in those sectors?
well, let's start with marketing, right? So, and of course, we see this every day working with the consultants that are supporting our business in marketing. Those people and how they work is virtually indistinguishable from 5 or 10 years ago, right? So, I would say that was almost the first cab off the rank to be completely disrupted because, first of all, what marketing looks like is completely different now than it was a decade ago. And
Right.
now, again, it's going to go through another change. So that whole industry of professional services for marketing has, really evolved. And uh, I think you'll see, and we see this with some of our consultants, whereas 5 years ago, we might have hired someone to have access to a senior partner who can do the big M marketing stuff. But the shift for us is that actually we're more likely to hire the specialist that can do a particular thing. And that person very often looks like a 22 to 24-year-old person with
Right.
a very specific skill set with regard to digital marketing or what social media or whatever that might be. So I think that's completely different, right? So you know, the I'm not saying there aren't still marketing and PR firms that are sort of the white shoe firms, and those firms still exist, but they're
Right.
much more reliant on, and the velocity of change is so fast. They're much more reliant on kind of very discrete skills, very, very much younger demographic, delivering those skills, highly technology enabled. So I think almost that's the first cab off the rank. For HR, which I would wrap into recruiting on that. And
Hmm.
HR has very different disciplines, right? So we start with the recruiting. Recruiting's pretty resilient in terms of its a very face-to-face kind of game. But even there, the platform firms, I don't know what they are that we had Monster and Indeed and
Right.
Seek
And
here in
yeah.
Australia, right? These firms play a big role in, a very big part of this, but some of that's a utility for the recruiters, and some of that is done independent of the recruiters. But that face-to-face contact is really important in that part of the industry. So um, you want to look somebody in the eye and know that they've vetted your candidates properly, because the risk is just too high not to get the right people in the right roles. Now, for lower tier roles, that's more open to technology, but I'd say the upper tier stuff is much more resilient.
But
In
even
the
some
rest,
of, I
yep,
was going to
sorry,
say
go
even
ahead.
I was just going to say even some of the larger elite recruiting firms, the Heidrick and Struggles, et cetera. Here, I know there some of them are moving into adjacencies, consulting, offering consulting services as well. So they are diversifying, I would say, in terms of what their capabilities are.
Right, and that's very wise, right? So if you have if you have these senior relationships, if you have a relationship with the chairman and the CEO, um,
Right.
then the obvious question is, how do I monetize that relationship? And so moving into those adjacencies makes sense to the extent that your brand can, kind of have an authentic and legitimate sort of feel for the client in that sense. But I think that makes sense, and that's always kind of happened. Maybe first you move laterally into HR consulting, then you progressively move into governance, and then you move in. There's a probably pretty logical pathway for firms like that to make that shift. HR strategy, then from
Yeah.
HR strategy, maybe you move into business strategy, et cetera, right? So that all kind of makes sense. But I guess my point was that those firms still exist because, you want to look the chairperson in the eye and say, this executive is a quality candidate, and it's just too much risk not to get it right. And you're not going to use a chatbot for that.
Right.
Although maybe in a half a decade you might do that. It's something to be considered for sure.
But I think what we're getting at is, when you look across the industry, professional services very broadly, the idea needs to be that these firms need to step back and say, what are the higher value activities that I could bring to my client that technology maybe can't do as well as a human or expert could do? Because you can't ignore the fact that, for example, just thinking about it from a technology disruptor perspective, there are things that technology can do better, right? Faster and better. All you have to do is show it the process, it'll pick it up and be able to repeat it much quicker. So it's really an opportunity to sort of reimagine what are the things that we actually can do, maybe things that you do today that they can't, but even what are some of the new um, activities that you can do, work that you can do, things that you can deliver to the client that will create value for them going forward. I think that's what they have to spend time thinking about. That's really where the opportunity is for them.
All right, well, let's talk about that playbook then. Okay, so if we accept that the traditional pyramid will be hollowed out at the bottom, right?
Hmm.
And that's debatable. It's not uniform across all parts of the, kind of the ecosystem of professional services, but it's certainly valid for a big part of it. So
Hmm.
from that point of view, your point is absolutely valid. The idea is, if the bottom's being hollowed out, how do I retreat upwards to value, right? So where can I, and this is kind of in part, how do I extract the maximum economic value out of my client relationships in exchange for the high end kind of advice, right?
Right.
So
Right.
that's really the game, and that advice often is very valuable. So David Meister said it 25 years ago. It's sort of like the company decisions are those that you want to talk to the partner about, and you need that expertise, and that's really important. But at the same time, the consequences of moving up the value chain are sort of threefold. One is your model stops looking like a pyramid. It slowly and progressively looks more like a diamond. And
Right.
that critical leverage um, starts to erode, which affects the economics of the firm, right? So unless you can replace that leverage with technology and retain that in terms of your sort of gross rates,
Right.
that's problematic. So I think that certainly is something you have to do. So that'd be number one on my playbook, and I agree with that. Number two is that I think firms need to build up a lens of how to look at their firm, not just as a collection of clients and sectors and domain expertise, but increasingly they have to think about their firm as a collection of workflows and
Hmm.
understanding better how those workflows then translate into value and what's the best way to monetize those workflows. And of the probably dozen professional services firms that we've spoken to, um, often because professional services firms are a collection of partners who very often have their own
Own
workflows
way
that
of doing
they're
things. Right. Yeah.
right? It's sort of a bit, it's not only complex, but politically difficult to get, in a smaller firm, 10, 20 partners, or in a bigger firm, 500 partners, to kind of agree on what the priorities are, which workflows need to be standardized and so forth. So that's a challenge, I think, for a lot of firms in their transformation efforts. So and again, like where is the opportunity to take advantage of technology or offshoring or whatever is definitely a priority. But I think the leap though is how do we extract more value? Because I think a lot of that value in those workflows is accruing not to the accounting firm or the law firm, it's accruing to the platform firm.
Right.
So, these firms have valuations of, 20 times EBIT compared to, maybe a 4x or a 2x EBIT for a professional services firm. It's completely different. Um, and I think that firms need to zoom back and say, what is the IP that we can extract out of the advice that we give, the workflows that we have, and and these relationships, and how do we turn that IP and into utilities that then can then be scaled, right?
Hmm.
I think that idea of kind of creating scalable models is something professional services firms aren't really great at. Even those that give advice to those who do it struggle sometimes to do it internally. Um, I'm on the board of a professional services business that I'm chairing that organization, and this is something that we're really working hard on. Is okay, we deliver great value to clients in terms of core engineering services, but there's so much more value to be extracted if you look across the history of all the advice that we've given and the capabilities that we've created for clients. How do you step back from that and then turn that capability into something scalable that then is relevant to a much larger global audience of clients and perhaps other engineering consultancies, right? So that's something you really have to focus on. And then the fourth thing, I think, to your point, is cautiously understand where that diversification really has to happen. You know what I
Hmm.
mean? So do you move laterally if you're a top tier recruiting firm, do you move laterally into HR consulting? If you're KPMG, do you move laterally into law? Um, there are some challenges with that as well, but I think
Hmm.
assumption that you're going to be able to grow using the existing model that maybe you've used for decades or even half a century is going to continue to be relevant and robust to the market that we live in, I think would be um, a high risk strategy to keep doing what you're doing in this environment.
Yeah. I mean, there's some, particularly when you think about the accounting firms, some of them have been acquiring technology capabilities that they need. I think I read that Deloitte is committed to spending like $3 billion on technology over the next 5 to 10 years. PwC, another 1.5 to $3 billion to acquire the technology capability, data scientists, et cetera, that they think they need to, differentiate going forward. So there, to me, the opportunity is a combination of, partnerships, acquisitions. There are some corporate law firms who are even looking to build, develop their own ALSPs.
Mm,
So I think it's like, how do you this capability is necessary for long-term success. This is either you're going to compete with them or get eaten up, right? To some extent, right? It's just to your point, it's going to continue to eat at the bottom until it can get to even be at that expert level where you are, unless you do something or take a step in that direction where you can at least slow it down. And I think partnership is probably a good way to start. Maybe some of these traditional law firms, if they haven't thought about it, should consider, partnering with an ALSP, so that they can outsource some of that lower end stuff to them, but maybe they still get a piece of the pie,
mm.
part of that.
Right. So in essence, that becomes a channel, right?
Right.
But your point about the PwCs and the Deloittes and so forth making these big investments, billion-dollar investments, part of that will be to enable their own consultants. But I think the more interesting thing is, do those investments translate into incubation of new capability then that can be
Yeah.
extrapolated?
Yeah.
So I think that's really the kind of the dual play there. And even small firms need to be thinking that way. But unfortunately, we've run out of time on this topic, and it'd be good to come back and revisit it, perhaps with a guest, to get some additional perspective here. But we're watching this area carefully to see how it evolves, and look forward to kind of revisiting this topic again sometime in the near future.
Absolutely. Absolutely. This has been great.
All right, Rondo, great to see you, and look forward to catching up on our next podcast.
Absolutely, Matt.